Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Before we get into this section, any follow-up or questions, thoughts from last time talking about Luther's childhood and his early education up until, well, really up through in the university. We got him to about, well, just right before he becomes a monk, and that's what we want to start with today. But anything from that? What I'm going to do first is I'm going to actually show you just a short video clip. I'm not going to show you, I attempted to show you the whole Luther movie, but just want to show you the opening credits because it shows it starting with this event, Luther, when he becomes a monk in the rains, thunderstorm. So this should go. Really, that's kind of all I wanted you to see. This is showing when he becomes when he's ordained as a priest. But I'm going to stop it there. Otherwise, we'd continue with on with the movie. There's a couple of things I wanted you to see as we go through this. In that, which you have first is the thunderstorm, where as Luther tells the story that he was on his way back to school from home, had gone home for a vacation or a break in school and was on his way home, and at Stutternheim, and I think this is where this stone is put up, where they suppose somewhere around there is where this actually took place, where he's caught in the storm in July and vows to become a monk. And you have that the quote underneath there that is Luther telling that story. With this stretch of Luther's life, and I've said this before, like when we get into this, studying this period, there's so much material, so like for me to, share quotes or something like that kind of summarize it. The problem is a lot of this material comes as recollections later on. So if you look, you see when this quote is actually recorded is in 1539. That's when he's sitting at the table, and the table talks, which were people recording what he's writing, what he's saying while he's speaking. And you'll have two different people writing it down. So you have two different accounts. It's also him recollecting it, and he recollects it different ways, different times. Like when exactly was this? And we had that when he had the story of him finding the Bible for the first time. And one time it says when I was a boy. Another time it sounds like it's when he's at the university. And so there's multiple, just like for this was one of three different stories that were written down about this particular event. And I think this one was the most comprehensive. So this must have been on the anniversary of when this took place. Today's the very date on which I entered the convent at Erfurt. And he began to tell the story of the conditions under which he had taken his vow, how nearly 14 years before, on a road near Stotternheim, not far from Erfurt, He was so frightened by a thunderbolt that in terror he shouted, "Help, dear Anne, I will become a monk." Remember when we talked last week about the time when he was also on his way, home, and cut himself with his sword on his leg and cut an artery? And there too, he's telling about how I prayed to Mary, and then when they called the doctor and tried to get the bleeding to stop, and he passed out, and the wound opened up again, and he was almost died. And he had said, "If I had died then, I would have died praying to Mary for help." And then he said, "But God understood my vow even in Hebrew," which I don't know what that if he prayed this in Hebrew. I don't. And under grace, it is no longer binding. Afterwards, I regretted my vow, and many of my friends tried to persuade me not to enter the monastery. I, however, was determined to go through with it, and the day before St. Alexius, I invited certain of my best friends to a farewell party, as on the next day they were to lead me into the monastery. To those, however, he left behind, he said, "Today you see me for the last time, and then no more." In tears they led me away, and my father was very angry about my vow. Yet I persisted in my determination. It never occurred to me to leave the monastery. I had died completely to the world again until God's proper time, and Junker Tetzel forced me to leave it, and Dr. Staupitz incited me against the Pope. He says, I planned to stay, except that I got involved in this other business. Junker, that's like Knight. Tetzel, who was preaching on indulgences, we'll get to that next week, and then Dr. Staupitz. So St. Alexius' day would be July 17th. So on July 16th, it says he had a farewell party. And there's one of the accounts that talks about him giving away some of his books. I don't know if he gave away, remember we talked about that law book that he had. Either he got it as a gift from his father or he bought it, different accounts. I don't know if that's one of the books that he gave away, as he says, I'm forsaking this. Through this whole thing, one of the things that historians and everyone likes to debate is what led to this. Was this a spur of the moment, like sudden decision, like he never thought about this before, but he's in the middle of the storm and he makes this rash vow, and then now I got to do it, but he hadn't been planning to do it? Or was it something he had been thinking seriously about for quite some time, and just this is what drove him over the edge? I would imagine that it's more of the latter, that he had been troubled in various ways, or thinking about this. You don't necessarily get the sense from Luther ever that he was in love with the law, that this is really what he wanted to do. You always hear that this is what his father wanted him to do, and supported him in that, and was able to give him pretty much the best education money could buy. And that's going to go throughout this period of what would they call as Anfechtung, which means trouble, suffering. He's wrestling with things. Is this already starting from childhood? And he was raised in a very strict home and schooling, very much under the law, and he'll talk about that. How much of that goes all the way back to before this even happens, before he even gets into the monastery, that he's trained to think that and trained to listen to his conscience, which is good, but he doesn't ignore his conscience, and so he's troubled, right? That's the picture that we have of Luther. So he enters the monastery. Although technically, even when he says, I will become a monk, technically, he doesn't actually become a monk. Not the technical term for the order that he enters into is the Augustinian. It's the order of the observance of the Augustinian friars, or sometimes it's called the Augustinian hermits. The term hermit is somewhat we use that. A hermit, someone who lives by themselves. That's what the word means. They would live from the earliest of monasteries. They'd have these monasteries. They would live all by themselves. Remember the guys when we were going through church history, the guys who would live up on the poles, and they'd have to bring food up to them. to forsake the world, they would separate from the world. And so but friars were one of these groups that they didn't just stay in a monastery. They would be teaching friars. So he had come across, when in his education, those brothers of the common life. They were teaching monks, and so was this group. In Erfurt, we had the university, and some of the teachers in the university were these friars. It was an order of asceticism. We talked about that also when we were going through church history. Asceticism is that setting aside, so the vow of poverty, of lowliness, beg. So if you take a vow of poverty, then they would have to beg for things, strict fasting. And there's always this question has been for a long time within monastic orders. You'd have the orders, and then they would get lax, and they would kind of slough off on following the rules, the order that they had vowed to do. And then there would come a reform movement that would say, now we're going to really do it. And so you had that here with the Augustinians. The Augustinians, I should mention that, they're called Augustinians, so that take their orders from St. Augustine, right? And so that's always, which is going to play into Luther's theology, that they would likely read from Augustine. And Augustine, in his own time, some of the same things that Luther's going to point out, Augustine had already long taught. But then there were two groups of these. There were the observants and the conventuals. Which is interesting, because the conventual sounds like convention, like they were conventional wisdom, like what was kind of the standing. Like these would be sort of the conservatives, in a sense. But what were they conserving? They were conserving their lax practice. They're not being observant. So you had this group within the Augustinians that wanted to follow the rule of St. Augustine more strictly, and the fasting rules, and the conventuals, the conventional wisdom in these orders was, well, we don't take that too seriously. So there was kind of a divide. And there was the order that he joined was an observant order, but there was a move to join all of these orders under the observant category. That's going to come up later when he goes to Rome. You saw in the video, it only showed it briefly, right after the storm. Then it shows him laying flat on the ground, which initially, because when that shows, it says Erfurt 1507. Well, that's when he becomes a priest. That's when he's ordained as a priest. When he takes his vows, that's 1505. And that's where he would be laying there in his black habit. So the habit of a monk are the clothes that he wears. And so they were called, that's why the place where he's going to live is called the Black Cloisters, because they wore black. It was over white. They'd have a white robe underneath it, but then they would have the black habit, and he was laying on the floor. That's what they do. And still when people become monks, they do that. They lay it flat on the. I was trying to find a picture. I could find it. Google Images. You can find it, from modern monasteries where they do that. They don't always. They don't lay flat on their face though. They let them put their hands up like here, and they just lay on the floor. But that's called laying prostrate, which is different than prostate. Those are two different words. I've heard people make those like prostrate's a different thing than prostrate. Prostrate is laying on your face. I'm not going to explain what prostate is. Different class for that. And so you see, what they've got is a little community, a walled thing. You can't find. This is a sketch from 1669. It's really tricky to try to figure out what these places looked like at Luther's day, but we can get sort of close. But there's a lot of things that happened from 1505 until 1669. But that's one thing that we can see. The building there stands as the monastery there in Erfurt, the Black Cloister. What the living conditions were. Oh, I was going to mention the tonsure, because you saw that in the video too. A tonsure is the haircut. and there were different kinds. All different kinds of monks had different tonsures, and that would kind of set them apart. Like some would have, you see where they shave the middle part, like a kind of a skull cap, and then they got a ring around them. Some would do almost look like mohawks, like they'd have like a line across, or they'd have different haircuts, different tonsures to mark different monasteries. The cell, so like that building is there, with no idea like what particular room Luther would have had at the time, but if you go there today, you would see a room like this set off so that you can see in that it was like a 7x10 cell with a bed, a chair, a table, and what else? That's it. No heat. Has has a window though. That's but no heat. You'd have meals twice a day, once in the middle of the day, and then in the evening. It'd be heavy fasts. So on July 17th is when he takes his vow. The Johann Staupitz it's called the Vicar General. He's the head of the monasteries, and not just of this monastery, but all the ones in Germany. And Luther and Staupitz are going to have this deep tie and relationship through this whole period. And so that's why we've got the quote there where he says that he was my father in this doctrine, in the doctrine, the teaching that he is discovered, but he says he did learn this from him, gave birth to me in Christ. And Staupitz is responsible for getting Luther involved in the teaching and in the further studies, convinces him. There's a story about him meeting with him outside the monastery under a pear tree and pushing him to go and get his studies and to be a student of theology. And so, especially then during this time, this what we call soul torment, his Anfechtung, Sturm und Drang, the storm and the raging of his conscience, and how to understand this. And he describes that later on, but he recalls, but though I was greatly pleased with such fine words and sweet praises, making me out as a miracle worker who had effected his own sanctification with so little effort, as one who could even devour death and the devil, yet I remained helpless. He says, every time a little temptation came of sin or death, I was down and out. Neither my baptism nor monastic vow seemed of any avail, as I had lost Christ and my baptism long ago. There in the convent, I was the most wretched man on earth, passing whole nights in weeping and feeling that everything was hopeless, which condition no one could alleviate. Thus I was bathed in my monkery and had a real sweating sickness. Thanks be to God that I was not consumed in my fever, for I would have been in the depths of hell long ago, in spite of my monastic baptism. For I no longer knew Christ, except as a stern judge from whom I wanted to flee, yet I was unable to escape. So he would read that you're supposed to love God, and he's like, love God? How can I love God if he's such... He sounds like a horrible, horrible judge. And I find myself hating him. But yet he's just. But how can I, and this wrestling. He would go to confession constantly. I think that's in the next quote. He describes, when he says like, either my baptism or my monastic vows, and they sort of looked at taking the monastic vows kind of like a fresh start. Like your monastic vows were supposed to be able to give you some points, to give you a fresh start. Like this was like a new baptism, which I think he realized later on that was a mistake to substitute something else for your baptism, and that it hadn't gone away. God's promise had not been removed from him. Top of the next page, you got this other one, similar. When I was a monk, I believed that it was all up with my salvation. Each time I experienced the temptations of the flesh, that is to say, a number of evil desires, such as hatred, anger, hatred, jealousy in regard to a brother, etc. I tried all kinds of remedies. I confessed daily, but it was of no avail. So Staupitz would have been his confessor early on. He was both his overseer and his confessor. And the story is that he would tell Luther, Luther would spend hours confessing his sins, and he says, "Come back to me when you have something interesting to confess." Because he was probably making stuff up. Not making it up like lying, but just like so overly obsessed with thinking that by, like, the more he did that, like, he would eventually get rid of it, and not realizing what, the true nature of sin or of forgiveness. The covetousness always returned. This is the reason I could find no peace, but was perpetually in torment, thinking, you have committed such and such a sin. You are still the victim of jealousy and concupiscence. In vain you have joined the order. All your good works are useless. This idea, I'm trying to think of what. He was always seeking solace and seeking comfort, but he wasn't finding it. And so, what I was going to say about when he talks about his evil desires, and I've got all these evil desires, and Luther's pretty free about himself and confessing or writing about, like, well, I felt this, and of course I mentioned last time, he can be a little crude sometimes, and so he'd confess like transgressions of the flesh and temptations to whatever, lust or something like that. And so that what's interesting is that you've got like scholars, historians, and they read Luther saying these things. This guy was a deviant. He was really dirty. Like, and they, kind of like Freudian, like seeing, they kind of see his like sexual urge behind everything, as if he was abnormal. I think he was just maybe abnormally honest. Like he just, if he felt it, he said it, and it wasn't probably anything unusual. Not like he was this crazed maniac, and that's because that's kind of how he's pictured. Then he goes, and the reason that he has to get married because he's so like he can't control himself. The problem, he could control himself in the flesh, but he knew that wasn't enough. That is, if his heart was wrong, he was wrong, right? Even if he could slay his body, and I remember hearing the stories, and I haven't come across it in this work, but of him like even like beating himself. I imagine there was some part of that somewhere. I just haven't come across it in the reading that I've done recently. But I remember always hearing that story. But even if he didn't do it physically, he was doing it to himself mentally, and just beating himself up. So I don't think this was his intent. The intent was not to become a priest and not go down this road, but I guess he's maybe talked into it. And so 2 years later, he does does become a priest. He's ordained in April of 1507. Then shortly after, on Cantate Sunday, again, like we'll recognize that's for the fifth Sunday of Easter. Same lectionary, same cycle was in place there. So May 2nd was his first Mass. That's what was depicted at the end of what I showed you. The horses coming because his father was coming, and he brought all these people. His father did come to that. You hear about him terrified at that. I remember when he first offers the Mass, like he kind of shook and almost spilled, because the Roman idea was that the priest was actually doing a sacrifice, and he was terrified at that idea, and also then further offending this God instead of seeing this as God's gracious gift to his people. This next quote there, this Pollock from Mellerstadt, this was one of the professors or teachers at Erfurt, kind of one of the people who had started, or I think founded the University at Erfurt or something like that. And he's commenting about Luther, and he says, this monk will confuse all the doctors. He will start a new religion and reform the whole Roman Church, for he bases his theology on the writings of the prophets and the apostles. Shocking, right? Uh, he stands on the words of Christ, which no philosopher or sophistry can upset or oppose, be it that of the Scotists, Albertists, Thomists, and of the entire Tardarat. And I don't even know what that is. But those are different strains of thought and scholarship. Like the Scotists are from Duns Scotus, like a dunce cap. The Duns Scotus was a teacher. Thomas, like Thomas Aquinas, right? Like this was the way of doing academic theology and scholarship. We call this the scholastics, and the way that they would treat theology. He says this guy's doing it different. He's just kind of going from the scriptures. And it's not that the scriptures weren't ever dealt with or known. They were known. But I suppose the approach got to be so systematized and so structured that the scriptures kind of ended up getting lost, and they weren't driving directly from that. And you combine that, well, and maybe this part of the cause, is Staupitz, as caring for Luther in his soul, wants to keep him busy. So he busies himself and sees the mind that he has and says, you know what, you should be studying theology. You should really, and probably do some teaching. And thinking he's going to relieve him by just making him so busy and use his mind, use his abilities. And so he does. So he convinces him to undertake theological studies. So again, remember, when he's going to school, at Erfurt, he's getting a bachelor and then the Master of Arts. That is the tools of learning. And then from there, you go from the arts to the sciences. And theology was known as the queen of the sciences. Theology is the queen and sciences are the things that can be studied, like law or philosophy, and theology is the queen of the sciences. Science comes from the Latin word to know. So sciences are things that are to be known, bodies of knowledge and study. And so he goes to study theology. There's sort of 4 steps in this. That's what you have in 1, 2, 3, 4 under theological studies. You have first a biblicus, which is like a bachelor's, formatus, sentiaros, and licentiatus. So the biblicus he gets in 1509, a Bachelor of Biblical Studies, which allows him to teach along with other teachers. So he's able to start teaching courses on the scriptures. Formatus, when they're learning theological terminology, he finishes that at Wittenberg. So this is the first place that Wittenberg is going to come into play. I've got the slides for showing Wittenberg, so we'll come back to the University of Wittenberg, but he's going to do some of that early there. And then he's going to go back to Erfurt. Once he gets his Sentiaros, when he's able to comment and lecture on Lombard's sentences, that was a medieval text, and they would have classes where you would lecture on this and go through Lombard's dogmatic work. Once he's got the license to do that, then they bring him back to Erfurt to start teaching on that. And then to become a doctor, this was a big deal, to become a doctor of the scriptures. And there the idea is, and Luther always held this for the rest of his life, this is what convinced him to say things and have feel like he had some authority to be able to speak to these things to the broad church. Here he is, just a monk in Erfurt, and later in Wittenberg, just a professor. What gives him the right to, maybe even address the Pope or the church at large? And that was because he was a doctor of Holy Scripture. That he was one who is called, and as he understands his vocation, as called as a teacher of the church. And now I have this obligation, this duty, to speak truth. Yeah. If he was still just, a lower level grunt, just teaching what he, then you just stay in his lane, stay where he is, but teach my students, but not dare to publish and things like that. And he said, because I'm a doctor of theology, and so as a part of that, just like so today, to get a doctorate, you have to have a doctoral dissertation that needs to be defended before a panel of people that critique it, and you need to be able to defend your they had a similar sort of thing in a debate. That was the nature of that. It also required fees to be paid, which Luther didn't have. And those were paid by the elector. The elector, I think, in exchange for agreeing that he would teach at Wittenberg for the rest of his life. And it comes to about $400. I don't know how that, like $400 in their time would, I don't know, like it was a good amount of money, and the prince had made it up and paid it. And once he did, then he could go through, and that was October of 1512. This process, what I think I read, it was supposed normally would take like 12 years. He did it in 5. So that gives you some indication that of the mind that he had. The Via Moderna, so that is both at the university at Erfurt, from men like William of Ockham. The books always cite these teachers from the previous eras that had a sort of a different way, and this new way, modern way, which favored the scriptures over Aristotle and philosophy. So it's just a shift in the way things were taught, and that he was taught by some of these people, and so that leads to the way he's going to approach the scriptures. And yet this doesn't, so that they lean towards the scriptures instead of like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, but still the Pope and the councils reign supreme. And so they can't get over that hurdle, which Luther's going to have to deal with. So like I said, he gets busy. He first is involved in teaching in Wittenberg. So remember, he's at Erfurt. But then, what is it? He replaces someone in 1513. Right away, as soon as he's got this, 1508 it is. Once he's starting, he does some teaching in Wittenberg, like on a philosophy course or something like that. It's not because he's not licensed to teach theology yet. He's sent to Wittenberg to teach in the fall of 1508, but by the next fall, he had completed that next level of his instruction. So they get him back to Erfurt to lecture on Lombard sentences in the cloister there at Erfurt. And then in 1510 is when he gets sent to Rome. So I think this is Staupitz's doing. And the issue was, so there was a petition that his cloister was petitioning the Pope to allow them, remember that observant versus conventual divide within the order? Well, there was a motion to merge them, and Staupitz was in favor of that, but their local branch wasn't in favor of it, and so they were like opposing it. And they had to actually bring the petition to Rome. They couldn't just like email it. They had to carry it. And the other guy, he goes to accompany another guy. Kind of Luther has no responsibility there on this trip. He's just there to accompany because the monks always had to travel in twos. And so the other guy, the older guy, is he's doing all the talking. Luther just gets to go along for this trip to Rome. It's about I don't know how many miles it is. And it depends on what route they took. They're walking, of course. But they figured it probably took about 40 days. 40 days of walking. They'd be able to stop at monasteries along the way. They always had spates that you could go and stay in various monasteries. There were a lot of monasteries. I should have looked that up. Like how many, like just when Luther's in Erfurt, there's probably a dozen, maybe. Dozen different kinds of monasteries or more. And they might be some be small, but it's they're all over the place. There were 13 of this order in Saxony, in different cities. So 40 days, and they get about 4 weeks there in Rome. Gets to Rome, and it's not what he expected. It was kind of a dump. You had places that probably. I don't know. I haven't been to Detroit anytime recently. But that's kind of what I'm picturing. Places that once had a bunch of homes or a bunch of stuff, and now it's just gone. Now it's just empty lots. There were sections of Rome. They still had the walls around it, but it was kind of that, and then the immorality that he would see, and the just crowds of people trying to go through there to see relics. There were indulgences that could be gotten for visiting relics, for saying certain prayers. There were if you went, to go to certain spots all around the city. You had to do it in one day, though, and you'd get an indulgence if you hit all these kind of tourist traps, but they were pilgrim sites, and you could get that. Or if you preached in a certain church on a particular day, then you got a thing. Or if you went up, the thing was with the stairs going up to, well, it's in Rome, but it's like to imitate the steps up to Pilate's palace. And Luther talks about that. He says, I wish to liberate my grandfather from purgatory. I went up the stairway of Pilate, praying Our Father on each step, for I was convinced that he who prayed thus could redeem his soul. But when I came to the top step, the thought kept coming to me, who knows whether this is true? He recalls having this horrible thought. He says, I kind of wished my parents were dead so that I could get them out of purgatory. But they were still living, so he couldn't do it yet, and so he, a little bit disenchanted with the church and in Rome. He said later, well, he did say, I would not have missed seeing Rome for 100,000 florins, for then I might have been afraid of being unfair to the Pope. So if I hadn't gone there, I might have thought I might have been unfair to him. Yeah. He said, otherwise I would not have believed what I saw with my own eyes. Godlessness and evil are great and shameless there. Neither God nor man, neither sin nor modesty are respected. So testify all the pious who were there and all the godless who returned worse from Italy. So, I mean, and part of it was with the clergy. It was just, I know you hear, the books where, like says that they've got brothels just for clergy. Which is, so the Roman Church, in forbidding marriage to priests and monks, they recognized that men still had desires, even though they would say that they had prayed for this gift of celibacy, but they didn't have this gift. They still had the urge and the desires, and they said, well, if you're going to do it, it would be better for you just to have to get a little something on the side rather than to marry. The exact opposite of what St. Paul writes, right? Better to marry than to burn with passion. And so then he gets back, and so like I said, he had already done some teaching in Wittenberg. Wittenberg was founded in 1502 or 4 or something like that. It was a new university in the city of Wittenberg. Wittenberg means White Mountain. You just kind of see that, also a mining area and on the river. What you have, you can see this, I don't know what the date is on this, 1536. So not too long while Luther's alive, it looks like this. That's the city church, the castle church, the one that he nails the 95 Theses to, that's over on that side. And then Luther's home is over here, is over on the far, complete other side. And that was the monastery, the Black Cloister, which then when Luther gets married is given to him as a wedding gift to live in. And so like when you think of like nailing the 95 Theses, remember he's got to walk all the way clear across town. The city church that's the one that Luther preaches in more. See, and then the university is not like we think of a college campus or something today where it's kind of like, concentrated. It's dispersed within within the city. It probably something like some of the colleges and universities like in New York City. Like, where do you find it? It's kind of all over the place. It's in the college owns buildings all around inside a city, and so it is generally in this side of town. But it was just buildings where these things would take place, and then you'd have housing would just be in with everything else, right? So it wasn't like here's the college, but the cloister was here, and like I said, there's the state church, the Stadtkirche, and then the Schlosskirche, the castle church, is over here. Although, let's see, this, I think that is what they look like. The steeples were destroyed in the in like 1546 after Luther dies. Those are knocked off and then they're not replaced for sometime. But the ones that are like there now that you'd see, or even at 1600, they're different than they were. And why were they knocked down? The war. Yeah, after Luther dies, the emperor comes after and gets Wittenberg, and Katie has to flee, and it's not a nice time. So here's the picture. This is from later on. This is from the 1600s of the university, which still exists today. This is I think the charter or something like that from when the university was founded, 1502. So it's not super old by the time Luther's there. And so Frederick the Wise, Luther's prince, is the one who founds this. And so getting good talent to come to the university is something very interested in. And certainly this is going to make a name for this university. Interestingly, Frederick the Wise, also one of the things that he was working on was this wonderful collection of relics. He had a very expensive collection of relics, which is going to give him some trouble when his monk, his professor, starts questioning how valuable these things are. And so the monastery, the cloister, this is the Black Cloister, that is the monastery there. So he's teaching, so he's living in the monastery, teaching in the university, also preaching in the cloister. He does, for a time, have to preach in the city. I'm trying to remember. The first time he has to preach for a stretch is because the pastor, the other priest, has some throat problem and can't speak, and so he's got to fill in, and he does that for a while. So he's teaching. Where am I? Wittenberg, trip to Rome. We're there. And so, this is the building. You can go in there today. Now it's a museum. It's the main museum for kind of Luther, and so it's a long room, long hall in this building. I don't know how much of that is set up to depict either how it was when it was a cloister or how it was when it was the Luther home, but building still stands. This in Wittenberg. This is the castle church, and I know this steeple too. This is not original, that kind of dome-shaped one. I don't know when that was put up, and it says Ein feste Burg, mighty fortress. Luther hadn't written a mighty fortress yet, and so that's put up later. But that's the castle church. You can see the church itself down here at night in the corner, and then this is the city church. So the other one, that's where the 95 Theses were posted, the castle church. This is in the middle of the city. The St. Mary's is what it's called. So the first Lutheran church was St. Mary's.
Where the buildings are built, how did they do that so many years ago? What's the height?
Yeah, back.
Mechanical stuff like they have nowadays.
Yeah, no. Yeah, scaffolding and a lot of time and expertise, and they. Yep. And and it's not like those. Remember when looking at those the museums right next to the historical sites. This is beautiful architecture, and then there's just like cinder block. It looks like a bunker right next to it. So then he begins. So once he gets his doctorate, 1512, then he's full in teaching. And he begins, the first thing that he's given to teach and to lecture on are the Psalms. The way this would work is he got a printer to print out, and every one of the students would have a copy of this. He'd have the Psalms text printed with space in between the lines and big margins, and all the students would get a copy of the Psalms like this. And this is Luther's copy of these 1513 Psalm lectures. So these are his notes. You'd have glosses, you'd have like little summaries of each of the verses, and then you'd have further notes. And we don't know with this, especially with this first course, we don't know what he actually said in class. What we have are, and this has been translated, we have this in English. We can read the notes that he had written down, what he actually said in class. Later on lectures, we have both what Luther had in his notes and what the students wrote down. So you can kind of piece together what actually was said in class compared to what he had written down in his notes. Yeah, and so he's lecturing in Latin at this point, lecturing on the Psalms in Latin. So he does this from 1513 through 15. He comes back to them in 1518. And so then we can compare, which is very interesting for seeing how Luther develops in his thinking, because he's gonna lecture on the same Psalms 5 years later, and you can see if does he have a different view on it. From the start, though, he recognizes the Psalms as a prophecy of Christ. And that's what he approaches them from. He goes on to lecture on Genesis later on, and then 1516 he gets to Romans. And when he lectures on Romans, he did the same thing with Romans. Again, he's still lecturing only in Latin. Where probably it's during this time, and that's what we'll start with next week, is when does the light flip on for him? What they might call his breakthrough, or they call it his tower experience, when he begins to understand more clearly justification by grace through faith, and not the structure that he had been trained in. I don't think we can find and go and say, well, there's like a moment like it just does flip a switch. Like at one point he's Roman Catholic, and then the next minute he's suddenly Lutheran. This is a process. He's studying the Scriptures, and the Scriptures is doing its work on him, and it's teaching him. But he's reading about the justice, the righteousness of God. He's reading about and understanding Christ in the Psalms, and then the clear teaching of Paul in Romans, and he's piecing it together. There does seem to be some moment, because he describes it. He describes himself kind of a realization that he has. But I don't think that's everything. I don't think it's just a complete switch. We can read, when we'll get to, and again next week we'll get to the 95 Theses, 1517. You can read the 95 Theses, and not all of his theology at this point is super great. He doesn't question indulgences entirely in the 95 Theses. He questions the abuse of them. So he's still working out the implications of that. But during this time when he's lecturing on Romans, it would seem like that's really shaping for him, and that's really driving his interesting one. The class period for his lectures on Romans was taught on Mondays and Fridays at 6 a.m. was when this class took place. So, yeah, college students can get up. I guess there's some big university students. But they would do, like, even it said when he was in the monastery hours was you'd go to bed when the sun went down, but they would get up like 4 a.m. So it'd be like, like sleeping hours like 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. or something like that. Like he then lectures on Galatians, And then on Hebrews, chalk-heavy books with the gospel dripping with Jesus. He does preaching. In the city church in 1514, that was to fill in for someone who was unable to preach there. Catechism sermons he preaches in 1516. It'd be a series on the catechism, his early series, and then he preaches on the catechism later on which leads to him writing what we know as the small catechism and large catechism. About 170 times a year he's preaching. So like you have service as well. The monastery, they'd have something every single day, and he wouldn't be preaching every single day. If they're in the monastery, you'd be reading a text of scripture and then preaching on it. If he was preaching in the church, is sort of a different thing. Usually, when you'd see Luther like preaching, if he was preaching in like the monastery, he would just wear his monastic robes. And that's where you sometimes see like a lot of the pictures of Luther are in his academic garb. That's what professors wore. If he was actually preaching in the church or leading the service in church, he would use the typical vestments for like the divine service, like we'd be used to. Similar.
What was the duration of the
sermons? A lot longer than. It's hard for us to know. Like when we have written sermons from Luther, they're likely not his manuscript. That's not what they come from. I don't know if they just would throw that away, or maybe he didn't even write it down. He could have just been speaking off the cuff for all we know, and sometimes it seems like maybe that's what he's doing. But our record are people writing down what they heard, and they could do that. Just like in all of this, the students were expected to write down everything that the professor said, and they were expected to fill in basically the same thing that Luther had here. Do you think it would be hard to take notes in class? Like, they could do it though. They could take down pretty much verbatim, and that's so most of the record that we have are people taking it down. There are some sermons though that I'm not sure if Luther ever actually preached them. They're called sermons, but I don't know if he ever actually preached them or if he just wrote them and then published them. But longer. Probably think like an hour. That was typical, at least later on. I would imagine Luther was the same. And it might have been different in the monastery because they just had different structure. You had different time constraints. But church typically, this time and for a few hundred years, church is more like 3 hours and the sermon's 1 hour of it or so. But then Luther will finish the sermon bill. I said, that's enough for today. His final sermon that he preaches before he dies, he says, that's kind of how he ends it, says, I'm a little weak. I think that's going to have to be enough for today. We'll pick it up later tomorrow. But something like that. Well, shall we close with a doxology?